It was a warm afternoon, and the streets were bustling with the usual crowd. Cars honked as they sped through traffic, and people were going about their daily routines. But amidst all the noise, something felt off. A police car cruised slowly through the area, and inside it sat Officer Martinez, a man known for his quick temper and harsh attitude, especially toward people who didn't look like him. Officer Martinez had been on patrol for hours and was growing restless. His eyes scanned the streets for something to do. He liked to be in control, and when he found someone who didn't fit his idea of order, he felt a rush of power. That's when he spotted her, an African-American woman driving alone, minding her business. His eyes narrowed. Without thinking, he turned on the siren and pulled her over. The woman didn't seem to be doing anything wrong, but that didn't matter to Martinez. He approached her car with a stern look, ready to make her life difficult. License and registration. He barked as the woman rolled down her window. Her expression was calm, but he could see the tension in her eyes. She handed over her documents, and as she did, she politely asked if there was a problem. Martinez didn't respond well to her calm demeanor. He didn't like that she wasn't scared of him. This, in his mind, was a chance to teach her a lesson. "You were speeding," he said, even though the woman's car was barely moving over the speed limit. It wasn't true, but it was a reason to stop her. He wrote her a ticket, but added some extra charges for good measure, things that didn't even make sense, just to make her uncomfortable. The woman's eyes widened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she asked if she could speak to his supervisor, as she knew something didn't feel right. Martinez grew angrier. He wasn't used to being questioned. He saw it as an opportunity to show her who was in charge. Without warning, he told her she was under arrest for resisting authority and disrupting the peace. It wasn't true, but it didn't matter. He slapped handcuffs on her wrists and shoved her toward his patrol car. The woman, confused but determined, said nothing. She knew she had done nothing wrong, but she also knew that sometimes arguing with the system could only make things worse. As she sat in the back of the police car, she tried to calm herself. She thought about her family, her friends, and the countless other people who had been treated unfairly by officers like Martinez. She had no idea that her life was about to take a turn in a way she never expected. The woman was just another person caught in a cycle of injustice, but she didn't know that the very officer who had arrested her was about to find out that she wasn't just some random person. She was someone very important, and the consequences of his actions would change everything. As the woman sat in the back of the police car, she couldn't help but wonder how things had gone so wrong. She had been pulled over for a simple check, nothing out of the ordinary. But now, here she was, handcuffed, on her way to the station, and completely bewildered. She glanced out of the window, trying to keep her mind from racing, but the thoughts wouldn't stop. The city's skyline looked so far away from the back of the squad car. She thought about how her day had started like any other, her plans simple, her goals straightforward. Now everything had changed in the blink of an eye. It was as if the world had shifted, and she was stuck in a situation where no matter how calm she stayed, things seemed to be spiraling. She had hoped to just speak with Officer Martinez and be on her way. That was all she wanted, to clear things up. But now, as the car rolled through the streets, she could feel the weight of the handcuffs on her wrists, a constant reminder of how powerless she felt. Her mind started to drift to the worst-case scenario. What if this wasn't a simple misunderstanding? What if this was something bigger, something more dangerous than just a wrong ticket? She could feel a pit forming in her stomach as doubt crept in. The ride felt longer than it should have. The silence in the car was deafening, except for the soft hum of the engine. Every bump on the road seemed to shake her, both physically and emotionally. She had been a strong woman all her life, dealing with obstacles, standing up for herself when necessary. But this felt different. This felt wrong in a way she couldn't explain. Her mind raced back to Officer Martinez, the way he had spoken to her, the way he had refused to listen. His words were sharp, and the arrogance in his voice made her blood boil. She had tried to stay composed, to keep her emotions in check, but the injustice of it all gnawed at her. She wasn't just another person to be pushed around, to be dismissed because of her skin color. She was a human being, and she deserved respect. As they neared the police station, she tried to steady her breathing. She wasn't going to let fear take over. She had to remain strong. She had done nothing wrong, and she would prove it. She had always believed that standing up for what's right was the only way to make things better. It was easy to feel helpless, but she refused to let that happen. When the car finally stopped outside the station, the officer opened the door and tugged her out. The cold night air hit her, and for a moment, she felt a sharp sense of clarity. The fear she had felt moments ago was now replaced with resolve. She wasn't going to let this slide. She wasn't going to be silenced or treated like she was less than anyone else. As the officer led her into the station, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just an unfair arrest. She didn't know it yet, but the story was about to take a turn, and everything would change for her in ways she could never have imagined. The injustice she faced wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of something far more significant. As the woman was led into the police station, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of uncertainty. The walls around her felt cold and impersonal, and the air seemed to press down on her chest. She was in a place where things could spiral out of control quickly, and she knew that if she didn't handle herself well, it could be much harder to make it out. She was alone, no one to back her up, and that reality made her feel even more isolated. However, in the back of her mind, she reminded herself of something important. She was stronger than this. She had always fought for what was right. She'd grown up facing challenges and had learned early in life that the world wasn't always fair. But that didn't mean she couldn't stand up for herself. It was what she had done in the past, and it was what she would do now. Inside the station, Officer Martinez handed her over to another officer. He barely glanced at her before moving on to other duties. The cold reception reminded her just how little she mattered to them. She was just another person caught in a web of injustice, and at that moment, it seemed like the system didn't care about her one bit. But as the officer walked her toward the holding cells, she tried to keep her mind focused. It wasn't over yet. She could still make it out of here. She thought about her family, her friends, and how she needed to stay strong, not only for herself, but for the people she loved. She couldn't let one bad moment define her entire life. She had dealt with adversity before, and this time would be no different. Meanwhile, far away, the captain of the police force was finishing up his day, unaware that his life was about to intersect with the woman's in a way he could never have predicted. Captain Reynolds was a man who believed in fairness. He didn't tolerate any form of abuse, especially within his own department. He had worked hard to earn the respect of his colleagues, and he held his team to a high standard. They were supposed to protect and serve, not take advantage of their positions. He trusted his officers, but that trust was starting to be tested. Captain Reynolds had recently gotten married to a woman who worked in a completely different field. His wife was someone who cared deeply about the community, and they had built a life together based on respect and understanding. They were partners in every sense of the word. Their bond was strong, rooted in trust, and a shared desire to make the world a better place. But little did he know that his wife was sitting in the holding cell, just down the hall from his office, completely unaware of the danger she was in. As the captain prepared for an evening meeting, the thought of his wife never crossed his mind. He had no idea that his day and his career would soon be thrown into turmoil. The events unfolding at the station were completely beyond his control, and they would soon demand his attention in ways he had never anticipated. The life he thought he had known was about to change in a matter of minutes, and no one could have predicted what would happen next. The woman, still in the holding cell, had no idea of the connection she had to the captain. She sat quietly, deep in thought, contemplating how to approach the situation ahead. Little did she know that soon, the captain would learn of her arrest, and the course of her future would change forever. Captain Reynolds walked into the station, His mind focused on the meeting he had scheduled with other officers. He had been working on improving some internal processes and making sure that his department ran as smoothly as possible. However, as soon as he entered his office, a call came through that changed everything. The dispatcher informed him that his wife had been arrested, an arrest that sounded completely out of place. The captain's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. His wife, someone who was always composed and calm, wouldn't just get arrested for no reason. There had to be more to it. Confusion gripped him as he listened to the details. His first thought was that this was some sort of mistake. Maybe someone had misidentified her, or maybe there had been a misunderstanding. But deep down, the captain knew something didn't add up. He knew the kind of person his wife was, and he couldn't fathom her doing anything that would justify being taken into custody. Still, he didn't have all the information, so he made the decision to head to the station immediately. He arrived at the police station, and as he walked through the front doors, he could feel the tension in the air. Officers were going about their business, but there was something off, an undercurrent of unease. The captain's reputation for fairness and honesty had earned him the respect of his colleagues, but it had also made him a target for those who didn't like to follow the rules. He could feel that some people were uncomfortable with him being there. He headed straight for the desk sergeant, who looked at him nervously as he walked up. "I need to speak to whoever is in charge of the arrest of my wife," the captain said, his voice steady but with a hint of urgency. The sergeant hesitated for a moment, glancing over his shoulder before he spoke. "That would be Officer Martinez, sir. He's the one who arrested her." Martinez. The captain didn't know the officer personally, but he had heard whispers about him. There were rumors that Martinez had been a bit of a loose cannon, acting on impulse rather than following procedure. The captain had always prided himself on making sure the department operated by the book, and Martinez's behavior didn't align with those values. The captain's thoughts began to shift. What could Martinez have been thinking when he made the decision to arrest his wife? He knew that his team wasn't perfect, but he never imagined one of his own would act in such an unprofessional manner. He quickly made his way toward the holding area, his heart racing. As he walked down the hallway, he couldn't help but think about how this situation could escalate. He had no idea what had happened, but he needed answers, and he needed them fast. When he reached the holding cell, his eyes landed on his wife. She was sitting quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up when she heard him approach, and there was a moment of silence between them. Her expression was calm, but the captain could see the strain in her eyes. She didn't have to say a word for him to know that something was terribly wrong. "Are you okay?" the captain asked, his voice soft. She nodded, but there was an underlying sadness in her expression. "I'm fine, but you need to know, this shouldn't have happened. It's all a mistake." The captain's mind was spinning. He hadn't yet heard the full story, but one thing was clear. This was not just a simple misunderstanding. He could feel it in his gut. As his wife explained what had happened, the captain's anger began to rise. He couldn't believe that his own officers, especially someone like Martinez, could be capable of such an unjust action. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, and the captain realized that his wife's arrest was only the beginning of a much bigger issue. He wasn't going to let this go. He wouldn't rest until the truth came out, no matter the cost. This wasn't just about his wife. It was about something much larger. It was about making sure that no one else had to go through the same injustice. The captain was determined to get to the bottom of it, no matter how hard the road ahead might be. Captain Reynolds stood in front of his wife, feeling a sense of urgency building inside him. His thoughts were racing as he processed everything she had just told him. It was clear now that this was no simple misunderstanding. Officer Martinez's actions had crossed a line, and the more the captain thought about it, the angrier he became. His wife didn't deserve to be treated this way. And the truth was that no one should have to endure such an unjust arrest, especially not for something so trivial. "Tell me everything," Captain Reynolds said, his voice firm but calm. He needed all the details, every single part of the story, no matter how small. He wanted to understand what had led to this moment and how things had gone so wrong. His wife took a deep breath and began explaining what had happened, recounting the events leading up to her arrest. She spoke clearly, but there was an undeniable frustration in her voice. She had been pulled over for no real reason, just a random stop by Officer Martinez. When she had asked him why he was stopping her, he hadn't given a direct answer. Instead, he had become defensive and rude, telling her that she was being disruptive and making things difficult. As she spoke, the captain could feel the anger boiling inside him. He had always believed in treating people with respect, no matter their background or who they were. But this officer, this person who was supposed to uphold the law, had done the complete opposite. His wife had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, locked in a holding cell, all because of the officer's misguided assumptions and poor judgment. When his wife had asked to speak to the officer's supervisor, she thought it would help clear things up. But instead, Martinez had used it as an excuse to escalate the situation. He didn't like being questioned, and that had only made him more determined to teach her a lesson, no matter how unfair or unjust it was. The captain listened intently, trying to keep his emotions in check. As his wife finished explaining what had happened, he stood there for a moment, taking it all in. This wasn't just a case of one officer overstepping his boundaries. This was about a larger issue of racial profiling, abuse of power, and the need for change. It wasn't just about his wife anymore. It was about doing what was right. "I'm going to handle this," the captain said, his voice steady. He knew he couldn't let this go. He couldn't just let an officer like Martinez continue to tarnish the reputation of the department and damage the trust that had been built over the years. He had to make sure this never happened again, not to anyone else. With determination in his eyes, the captain turned and walked out of the holding area. He had to find Martinez, confront him, and make sure he understood the gravity of his actions. But more than that, he needed to put things in motion to ensure that this kind of injustice would no longer be tolerated in his department. The captain's mind was focused. He wasn't just going to let this situation slide. Martinez needed to answer for what he had done, and the consequences would be far-reaching. The captain was willing to do whatever it took to restore justice and hold the officers accountable. He would make sure that his wife's experience was not in vain, and that no one else would have to endure what she had gone through. This was his mission now. Nothing would stop him from seeing it through. Captain Reynolds walked down the hallway with purpose, his mind already racing through the possibilities of what he would do next. His wife's words echoed in his mind, and he knew that what had happened to her was only the surface of a much deeper issue. Officer Martinez's actions had been unjust, but now, it was his responsibility to ensure that this didn't happen again, to anyone. The weight of the situation was heavy on his shoulders, but he was determined. He had always believed in fairness, and this time, he was going to make sure that fairness prevailed. As he approached the office, he could see Martinez sitting at his desk, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit him. The captain took a deep breath, preparing himself for the confrontation. He needed to stay calm, to be rational, but the anger inside him was hard to suppress. Martinez had overstepped, and now there were consequences to be faced. "Officer Martinez," Captain Reynolds called as he entered the room. Martinez looked up, his face blank for a moment before recognition set in. His posture straightened, but there was an almost casual air about him, as if he had no idea that his actions had already set a chain of events into motion. The captain wasted no time. "I'd just spoken with my wife. I know what happened earlier today, and I want to hear it from you." His voice was firm, but there was no need to shout. The gravity of the situation was clear, and the captain didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. Martinez shifted in his seat, a slight hesitation crossing his face. He knew the captain was not someone to be trifled with, but he wasn't prepared for the confrontation he was about to face. He tried to defend his actions, saying that he had been doing his job, that the woman had been uncooperative, and had made things difficult. But the captain was not buying it. He had already heard his wife's side of the story, and the inconsistencies in Martinez's account were immediately evident. "You pulled her over without cause," the captain said, his voice growing colder. "You escalated a situation that didn't need to be escalated. You arrested her without any valid reason. That's not how we do things here. Not on my watch." Martinez's face flushed as the captain's words sank in. He tried to explain himself, but the captain was relentless. "I don't want excuses, Martinez. I want accountability. You've violated the trust that's been placed in you, and you will answer for it." The room grew tense as the captain laid out the facts. Martinez had not only broken protocol, but had let his personal biases affect his judgment. This wasn't about enforcing the law. It was about asserting power over someone he saw as lesser. And that, the captain knew, was a dangerous mindset for any officer to have. "You will be suspended," the captain continued. "An internal investigation will be launched, and you will face disciplinary actions for your conduct. The public needs to know that we won't tolerate this behavior in our department." Martinez sat in stunned silence as the weight of the captain's words settled over him. For the first time, he realized that his actions had serious consequences. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. This could cost him his job, his career, and his reputation. The captain stood up, his decision final. "You'll be removed from active duty until further notice. I want you to understand that this is not a decision I take lightly. But justice must be served, and I won't let anyone undermine the integrity of this department." Martinez nodded reluctantly, his pride bruised, but there was nothing he could say. The captain had made his position clear, and there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. As the captain turned to leave, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. He had taken the first step in restoring fairness, and he wouldn't rest until the department was held accountable for every officer's actions. But he also knew that this was only the beginning. Martinez's punishment was just one part of a larger issue, and the captain wasn't going to stop until changes were made within the force. His wife's ordeal had opened his eyes to the deeper problems that needed addressing, and he was determined to make things right. There was work to be done, but the captain was ready for whatever came next. After the confrontation with Officer Martinez, Captain Reynolds felt a mixture of emotions. The anger had subsided, replaced by a sense of resolve. He had made the right decision, but the journey ahead would not be easy. He knew this wasn't just about punishing one officer for his mistakes. This was about addressing a larger issue that had been festering within the department for far too long. It was about making sure that incidents like the one his wife had experienced never happened again. The captain wasted no time. He immediately called for a meeting with the senior officers. He knew that change would require the support of his colleagues, and he needed them to understand the gravity of the situation. When the officers gathered, the room was filled with tension. They all knew why they were there, but none of them fully understood the extent of what was about to unfold. "Today, we've had a breach of trust within our department," Captain Reynolds began, his voice steady but filled with authority. "Officer Martinez's actions were unacceptable, and they shone a light on a much deeper problem. This isn't just about one officer acting out. This is about a culture we've allowed to persist, where certain behaviors are tolerated, and where fairness and justice take a back seat." There was a moment of silence in the room. The officers exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. Some were uncomfortable, others seemed defensive. The captain could feel the shift in the air. He knew that change would be met with resistance, but he was determined to see it through. He wasn't going to let this moment slip away. "We are here to serve and protect," the captain continued. "We are not above the law. We cannot let our personal biases cloud our judgment, and we cannot let one officer's misconduct go unchecked. This is about the values we stand for, and I will not let those values be compromised." Some of the officers nodded in agreement, while others remained silent. Captain Reynolds could see that this was a turning point. It was time for the department to reckon with its own shortcomings, to confront the uncomfortable truths that had been ignored for far too long. The captain moved on to the next part of his plan. We will be implementing a series of reforms. First, I am calling for a complete review of our training programs. We need to ensure that every officer understands the importance of fairness, respect, and accountability. This is not just about following procedures. It's about understanding the impact of our actions on the community we serve. He could see the officers starting to listen more attentively now. They knew that these reforms would require them to change how they thought about their jobs. It would challenge their assumptions and force them to examine their own behavior. But Captain Reynolds knew it was necessary. He couldn't afford to back down. Second, the captain continued, we will establish an anonymous reporting system for misconduct. If any officer witnesses unethical behavior, they must feel safe coming forward without fear of retaliation. Our department cannot operate with secrecy. If we are to regain the trust of the public, we must hold ourselves to the highest standards. A few officers shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of being held accountable by their peers. But the captain remained firm. He wasn't asking for permission. He was telling them what needed to be done. The meeting went on for several more hours as the captain outlined the full scope of the reforms. He made it clear that these changes wouldn't happen overnight, but they had to start now. It was time to rebuild the department, to restore its integrity, and to make sure that justice was served not only in the courtroom, but also in every interaction between the officers and the community. As the meeting ended, Captain Reynolds walked out of the room with a sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead would be challenging. He would face opposition, and not everyone would be on board with his vision. But he was ready. He had taken the first step toward change, and now he had to see it through. Later that evening, as he sat with his wife, he told her about the reforms he had set in motion. She listened quietly, her expression one of relief and pride. "I'm glad you're doing something about it," she said softly. "This isn't just about us. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." The captain nodded, knowing that his work was far from over. He had set the wheels of change in motion, but it would take time to see the results. He couldn't promise that everything would be perfect, but he could promise that he would do everything in his power to make sure the department was better, fairer, and more just for everyone. And that, he knew, was the only way forward. The days that followed Captain Reynolds' meeting were filled with a whirlwind of activity. The reforms he had laid out were being put into motion, but they weren't easy to implement. Change, especially in a system that had functioned a certain way for so long, never came without resistance. There were moments of doubt, times when the captain wondered if the road ahead was too steep, but he refused to give up. He knew that if he wanted to restore the integrity of the police department, it had to start with these difficult conversations and actions. It wasn't just about the internal changes he was pushing for. The captain also knew that the public needed to see that the department was serious about accountability. He worked with his team to ensure transparency, holding press conferences to explain the reforms and the importance of holding officers accountable for their actions. There was backlash from some corners, but there was also support. People were beginning to recognize that the captain wasn't just taking a stand for his wife, but for every member of the community who had ever been wronged. Meanwhile, Officer Martinez was on suspension, awaiting the results of the internal investigation. The captain knew that the process would be long, but he also understood that it was crucial to show that no one, no matter their position, was above the law. Martinez had made a mistake, but the captain believed that the investigation had to be thorough, fair, and just. It wasn't just about punishing someone. It was about ensuring that the actions of one officer didn't reflect the values of the entire department. As the investigation continued, the captain remained vigilant, ensuring that the reforms were being followed and that the department's officers were receiving the proper training. There were setbacks, of course. Some officers were reluctant to change, and a few resented the new measures. But for every officer who resisted, there were others who were eager to embrace the new direction. The captain saw this as a sign of hope. Not everyone would change overnight, but the seeds were being planted. The most difficult part for Captain Reynolds was seeing the impact his wife's arrest had on her. She had been shaken by the whole experience, but her strength and resilience had shown through. She had always been someone who fought for what was right, and even though this had been a painful chapter in her life, she was determined to make a difference. The two of them worked together, side by side, to ensure that this issue wasn't forgotten, that it wasn't brushed under the rug. They knew that it wasn't enough to just make the changes. They had to make sure the department and the community understood why those changes were necessary. Over time, the atmosphere in the station began to shift. The officers started to talk more openly about their roles, about the challenges they faced in their work, and about the importance of respecting the people they were sworn to protect. It wasn't perfect, but there was a noticeable change in the air. Officers were more aware of the consequences of their actions, more mindful of how their behavior affected the community. It wasn't an instant fix, but it was progress. Months later, as the internal investigation into Officer Martinez was nearing its end, the captain sat down with his wife again. He could see the weariness in her eyes, but there was also a sense of peace. She had been through so much, and while the experience had left scars, it had also opened up a new path for both of them to make a difference. The captain looked at her, his heart filled with gratitude. "We've made a lot of progress," he said softly, his voice filled with conviction. "But we still have a long way to go." His wife nodded, her smile warm. "We'll get there, together." And with that, Captain Reynolds knew that the journey was far from over. But he had taken the first steps toward real change, and that, he believed, was the only way forward. The department was evolving, the community was listening, and there was hope that one day, no one would ever have to face the same injustice his wife had experienced. The fight wasn't just about one officer, it was about building a better future, one where fairness and respect reigned above all else. And that was a future he was willing to fight for.